I would like, for my part, congratulate and thank all the organizers of this event. And normally I would be there with you in London, but unfortunately COVID-19 canceled my plan to be there. So I'm talking to you through Zoom. I'm going to present Ilyenkov's contribution to dialectics and the problem of deduction. I will not present all the issues that I'm addressing in my paper in order to have more time in the part of the discussion. So I'm moving forward to present my presentation. So I'll start with a brief summary of the history of the interpretations of the dialectics, because in my opinion, it's very important to understand that dialectics is understanding is not something fixed. It's something that it has developed throughout the time and throughout the history of Marxism. Dialectics is arguably one of the most debatable concepts in the history of Marxism. Differences in the understanding of dialectics can be found even in the thought of Marx and Engels. In the aftermath of Marx and Engels' death, the majority of the Marxists of the period, they focused mainly the formulations of the writings that were published, was published at the time. And the majority of the thinkers, they understood dialectics in a very simplistic way through examples in nature or in other spheres of reality, such as the case of Plekhanov and so on. The official Diamat, who was understanding and presenting dialectics as a certain sum of principles. Lenin was the one who highlighted the importance of science of logic, of Hegel's science of logic, in order to understand Marx's Capital. And with the exception of Lenin, a few others, the majority of the thinkers, they used to understand dialectic in a very simplistic way. But this kind of historical development of the interpretations and of the understanding of dialectics, a very important historical event takes place between 1939 and 1941. Is the publication of the manuscripts of Marx manuscripts of 1857-1858, the so-called Grundrisse, in which Marx discusses the method of ascent from the abstract to the concrete, and he's doing that in direct dialogue with the history of political economy and their methods, and also with Hegel's logic, with Hegel's philosophical heritage. Since after the publication of Grundrisse, and especially after the war, and especially in the decade of 60s, with Ilyenkov to be one of the most eminent thinkers of this period, dialectics started to be discussed and understood as the method of ascent from the abstract to the concrete. And the discussion of dialectics from this perspective gradually raised the question of Marx's method in Capital. Vasulin, for example, in one of his interviews, claims that Ilyenkov was the first who clearly and systematically raised the question about the ascent from the abstract to the concrete in Marx's Capital. Ilyenkov writes in his book, published in the 1960, a genuinely concrete substantiation of the method of ascent from the abstract to the concrete as the only scientifically correct method of logical development, as the only method corresponding to the objective dialectics, should be looked for in Marx's Capital, in the analysis of its logical structure. In concluding the first section of this part, which to my opinion is very important, in order to understand the contribution of Ilyenkov, dialectics, since the dialectic is starting to be understood as the ascent from the abstract to the concrete, and especially through the logic of Capital, dialectics is now understood in a very systematic level. So it's important to stress that after the death of Marx and Engels, we have a history of the dialectics interpretations, and it is in the decade of 60s, and with a very important and crucial contribution of Ilyenkov, that we reach some of the philosophers of the Soviet Union, we reach a level of systematic understanding of the dialectics. Now, In order to understand the specificity of dialectical method, we have to consider it within the broader framework of the cognitive process of cognition. The method of ascent from the abstract to the concrete is defined by the general course of thought, of thinking. It starts from the abstract categories, concepts, and proceeds towards the concrete ones. This kind of movement of thinking constitutes a system of hierarchically ordered categories through which the inner structure and the history of the subject matter are represented. A considerable part of the literature, the West, also in the East, if we follow this division, it is rightly emphasized and correctly that the dialectics is a kind of synthesis or synthetic deduction. Analysis, which is the first moment of cognition, analytic cognition, starts from a concrete and moves towards abstract. The movement from a concrete to the abstract is the movement from the sensory experience to conceptual thinking, to the abstract determinations. In this sense, the movement from the concrete to the abstract is strictly associated with the method of induction. On the other hand, synthesis represents the object as a unity of multiple determinations, and for this reason is mainly associated with the method of deduction. One can assume that the method of ascent from the abstract to the concrete responds to synthetic cognition, and that Marx's method in Capital is a kind of conventional deduction. However, this kind of assumption would be totally wrong. Ilyenkov, in his book, explains why Marx's method in Capital, namely the ascent from the abstract to the concrete, differs radically from conventional deduction and from synthetic cognition. Ilyenkov takes as a case study Ricardo's approach to the economy, the critique of Ricardo's and the critique of Marx in Ricardo's theory, in the theories of surplus value. Ricardo's approach is synthetic and deductive, since he attempts to determine every singular and particular aspect of the economy as a transformation of the value, of the universal category of value and of the labor theory of value. Ilyenkov argues that Ricardo's view did not consist the reduction of complex phenomena, a number of their elementary constituents, as it is the case in analysis, but rather in the deduction of all complex phenomena from one single substance. And for this reason, Ricardo's approach is primarily synthetic. Taking the labor theory of value as a universal abstract concept, Ricardo examines whether or not the particular relations and aspects of the economy accord with this substance. However, interconnection of the various categories in Ricardo's approach is attempted through the common aspects that those concrete, abstract, and particular aspects they share. In this reason, Ricardo cannot determine the particularities and the specificities of the concrete and phenomenal aspects of the economy. When he cannot reduce them and explain them through the universal substance of value, Ricardo is compelled to extract them through the use of empirical induction by turning uncritically to empirical data. Ilyenkov explains that in his analysis of money, Ricardo constructs theoretical determinations of the money form through empirical induction. As a result, he cannot distinguish, Ricardo, the determinations that belong to money from the determination that money acquires as a part of the movement of capital. In this sense, Ricardo's method is a kind of formal deduction, as Ilyenkov argues. It is a form of synthesis in which the determinateness of particular and singular aspects and relations supposes the term the empirical induction. And Ilyenkov goes further, deeper, because he explains the main limitation of synthetic cognition, deduction, lies in its ahistorical character. Following Marx in the theories of surplus value, explains that Ricardo's deductive method lies in the consideration of his subject matter as eternal, rather than as an organic whole. Even though synthetic cognition reveals necessary inner relations and laws, it fails to reveal the precise inner motion of the subject matter. In other words, it fails to depict and to represent the subject as an organic unity, as a self-development totality. Hegel, in the Science of Logic, stresses that synthetic cognition reveals propositional laws and proves their necessity, but it proves the latter not as a necessity inherent in a fact in and for itself. Hence, the main limitation of deductive method and of synthetic cognition is that it fails to represent the object's inner motion and historical development. In this way, Ilyenkov points out that all the advantages of Ricardo's are related to his synthetic point of view, his substantive point of view. But all its defects are related to the historical consideration of the subject matter. Hegel's philosophical heritage, and mainly the science of logic, provides to Marx's examination in Capital, is that the systematic articulation of the logical categories in science of logic enables, from the materialistic point of view, the representation both of the structure and the self-movement of the subject matter. In this way, the dialectical derivation of categories is strictly associated with the consideration of the object as a process in development, namely as a historical process, the beginning and future end. In this way, Ilyenkov very clearly proves that dialectics, taken as the ascent from the abstract to the concrete, strictly associated with historicism, that historicity and the historical consideration of the subject matter is an inherent aspect of the dialectical method of approach. For this reason, Ilyenkov argues that without an understanding of the relation of the logical and the historical, the method of ascent from the abstract to the concrete remains inexplicable. In this sense, dialectics goes beyond conventional methods of induction and deduction. In its structural features, dialectics, taken as the ascent from the abstract to the concrete, coincides with Hegel's absolute method, something also stressed by Lenin in his philosophical notebooks. And Hegel's absolute method can be defined as both analytic and synthetic, as both inductive and deductive. Ilyenkov notes that dialectics is the area where conscious, intentional coincidence of the inductive, the deductive moments takes place. In this sense, dialectics is the sublation of induction, deduction, is the sublation of analytic cognition, synthetic cognition. Dialectics, on the one hand, is analytic, since the logical progression renders explicit what was previously implicit. On the other hand, dialectics is synthetic, because its subsequent category not represents only what was previously implicit, but also this logical progression constitutes a form of generation of the new categories. In this sense, the ascent from the abstract to the concrete is a kind of immanent deduction. This means that the articulation of the theoretical determinations represents both the sides of the object as internally interwoven with his history. So the history of the object, the self-movement of the object, its structure are represented as interrelated. In this sense, Ilyenkov points out that deduction based on conscious historicism becomes the only logical form corresponding to the view of the object as historically emerging, developing other than ready-made. In conclusion, Ilyenkov's contribution demonstrates that dialectics should be understood systematically, which means as the ascent from the abstract to the concrete. And this contribution of Ilyenkov leads to a historical period that the systematic understanding of dialectics is possible, and without the very formalistic and simplistic paradigm of the official diagmat or other philosophical approaches. Dialectics is not just a deduction or just a form of synthesis, but is the sublation of induction, deduction, the sublation of analytic and synthetic cognition. In dialectics, subject matter is studied as a specific historical process with a beginning and future end. In this sense, historicity and historicism prove to be an inherent aspect of the dialectical derivation of categories. Consequently, the relation of the logical and the historical has to be a fundamental aspect in order to understand dialectics. In this sense, dialectic is a kind of immanent deduction through which the inner structure, the historical development, the organic whole, namely of the self-moving totality, are represented. To conclude and to say a few words more, very briefly, I would like to say that, to my opinion, 21st century, humanity faces enormous challenges and very extremely implications. And the return to some kind of dialectical approach is fundamental in order to trace the perspectives of humanity. In this sense, Ilyenkov's philosophy and Ilyenkov's dialectical approach is not something that belongs uniquely to the past and to be studied as a historical event, but it's a philosophy which belongs to the present, and mostly is a philosophy which belongs also to the future. Thank you very much for your time.
So again, 10 minutes for questions. Do we have any questions or comments in the room?
Thank you for that. A question which has arisen in my mind for several of the talks is usually go through this ascent from abstract to concrete, which many speakers have done, and also there's been disagreement about what a germ cell is. The germ cell is the start of an ascent from abstract to concrete, so that relates to what you said too. You said that in the first stage, where you start with a concrete and you move to the abstract, you said that was a phase of induction, and you said you start with concrete concepts and get to abstract ones, which aren't empirical. You also said they're not empirical. So you have this empirical concrete, then you move away from it to abstract concepts. I think it's very clear, and you may agree with this, that that's not what Ilyenkov says. Ilyenkov clearly says that that's what Hegel's doing. Hegel will do what you, as you described, there's some sort of concrete, empirical, and then you go to an abstract universe and build up from there. But Ilyenkov says that you find in the empirical an abstract thing. In the case of Marx's Capital, you find the commodity. So Ilyenkov really stresses that this is not the same as Ilyenkov's, as Hegel. Hegel does not think there's a concrete thing that you can find empirically, and that it is both individual and singular and universal at the same time. So for Ilyenkov, the commodity has a methodological character which you can't find a parallel for in Hegel. He says something similar about the definition of when you try to define when you think of humanity and what is humanity, he says if you define humans as a tool-making animal, well, you can find real tools, people using them, and that is, again, it's a universal, it's a starting point from ascent from abstract to concrete, but it's also a real object at the same time in the world of objects. And again, he says that is a Marxian definition, a Marxian self-form, but it's not a Hegelian one. So this is an area where Ilyenkov picks out a big difference between Hegel's dialectic and Marx's. At least that's how I read it. Maybe I'm completely wrong, but I'd be interested in what you think. Thank you.
Can I answer? Thank you very much for the question. Okay, I will try to answer your question if I will understand your argument. I wouldn't say that the correct, for example, movement of thought is from the concrete to the abstract. On the contrary, I totally agree with Ilyenkov and with Marx that the scientific correct method is this one that goes from the abstract to the concrete. But Ilyenkov, in his book Dialectics of the Abstract and the Concrete in Marx's Capital, also highlights that induction, the method that goes from the concrete to the abstract. What I want to say in my presentation is that the movement from the abstract to the concrete as Marx in the chapter of the method of political economy also stresses, Marx in the part of the manuscripts of the Grundrisse stresses that this movement had been also attempted by the previous economists. And the movement from the abstract to the concrete as a synthetic movement characterizes also the method of Descartes, the method of Spinoza. So the movement from the abstract to the concrete, which Marx or Hegel or Ilyenkov talks about, is something more developed than the previous synthetic approaches, also from the analytic. So in order to understand in which elements the dialectic of Marx, Ilyenkov and Hegel differs from the previous synthetic approach, we have to consider also the analytic stage and to understand that Marx's method is both analytic and synthetic. That's my argument. So I wouldn't say that the analysis is the correct movement of thought. The correct movement, the scientifically correct movement, is the movement from the abstract to the concrete. But this movement from the abstract to the concrete is not something very, very simple.
No, that's not what I was saying. It's too difficult. All I'm saying is that the abstract universal, the starting move from the abstract to the concrete, has a different methodological nature in Marx's understanding of the method to Hegel's understanding of the method. So if you look what Ilyenkov says in both these main books on this, the Dialectics of the Abstract and the Concrete and Dialectical Logic, he explicitly contrasts his understanding of the starting point of the ascent, the germ cell. What is the character of the germ cell? In Marx, the character of the germ cell is it's an actual object amongst other objects in the system you're trying to explain. For Hegel, it is not. And so Ilyenkov stresses this difference. That's what I'm trying to say.
Okay, and yeah. I totally agree with that. For example, the abstract of Marx, the commodity, is also something concrete, while in Hegel is not. I totally agree with that.
Okay, and Karina, and then we need to vote.
I think this brings us back to Felipe's point about the object being a process, and that when we're talking about the practice and process of cognition, we're dealing with processes. Therefore, when you're outlining the moments of cognition here from the abstract and the concrete. So that abstract, this has been a very big argument for a long time. How can we say we're starting from the abstract? How can that be possible when we're in the real physical world of sensation? I mean, it is a contradiction. But I think the way we can resolve it is by saying that this first moment in our movement of cognition is abstract because we're having to abstract something from a moving process. We're fixating a moment of an ongoing process, and that is an abstract moment. But that then is immediately negated and sublated, and that's where this came up yesterday. I think this Aufhebung moment, the word Aufhebung, which causes a lot of confusion because it's both completely opposite things within one word. In German, it means to preserve and to destroy, so or to negate. So this moment from the abstract, from the first identity, which contains already difference, that's the richness of it. But we have to identify, abstract it, and then we go to the next moment. I don't know if that makes it any clearer. So we're going from an abstract identity to a difference, which is also abstract, and then it has to be mediated.
Corina, the movement from the abstract identity to the difference is synthetic.
Yes.
Okay.
But it's also
I don't think so that I say the opposite. For example, I take one of the what?
I was just trying to resolve the problem that Andy was raising.
To say only one phrase. Marx, for example, in his chapter that he was the results of the immediate production process, is saying the following: we start with a commodity, Now after the examination of the production, we return again to the commodity in the sphere of circulation. So we see there the starting point now, or at the point of arrival. And, this spiral way of the movement of thinking is exactly the dialectical thinking, that the abstract is concrete at the same time, but it is abstract in the process of thinking, in the process of the reconstitution of the whole through the development of the logical categories.
Thank you very much, Giannis. Okay, we are only going to have